In the second part of the lecture on nutrition and metabolism, we're going to be talking about proteins, about metabolic states, and a little bit about vitamins and minerals. Once again, the material is from Lecture 12 and Chapter 24 in Merib. Let's begin by talking about proteins. This is the last of the macromolecules that we want to talk about. Some of the sources of proteins include meats, cheeses, nuts, legumes. Legumes are beans, peas, soybeans. Any excesses of protein, as you might guess, can lead to obesity. We talked about the pathways of interconversion at the very beginning of this lecture in Part 1. So naturally, excesses of proteins can also lead to obesity. Deficiencies in protein is more important. These can lead to extreme weight loss, muscle wasting by using the muscle protein for energy. These can lead to anemia, growth retardation. So it's worse to have a deficiency of protein than it really is to have an excess of protein. Now we can classify proteins as either complete or incomplete proteins. Complete proteins, as you might guess from this definition of incomplete proteins, basically can support human tissues and normal growth all by themselves. However, incomplete proteins are unable to maintain human tissues. As an example, cereals have low levels of lysine. Grains usually have low levels of isoleucine and lysine. Legumes have low level of methionine, tryptophan, cysteine. So certain grain products, legumes, cereals are low in certain amino acids. And it turns out that when we eat, we have to take in a complete pool of amino acids at that meal in order for that protein to function to make the tissues that we need in the body. So if a protein that we take in is missing any of the amino acids, either in amount or proportion that's correct for our bodies, we would call that an incomplete protein. This leads to something like food combining, where we can combine, for example, rice and beans. This would combine the grains with legumes, and so the complementary amino acids can make up and actually form a complete protein out of two separate incomplete proteins. So food combining becomes very important, especially for people who are vegetarians and don't get complete protein from animal protein. Now the RDA for protein is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. We can also say it's about 10% of the diet in terms of calories. And I want to remind you of this. 1 kilogram is equal to 2.2 pounds. This is a conversion factor we're going to use in just a second. Let's use an example. Let's say that we have a patient that weighs 170 pounds. This is average body weight. And what we want to do is we want to find out their RDA in terms of grams of protein per day. Well, the definition that we have here, if you notice, is given in kilograms of body weight. So what we have to do is convert the 170 pounds into kilograms. And our conversion factor for doing that is to multiply this by 1 kilogram is 2.2 pounds. We'll put the 2.2 pounds on the bottom, and that will allow us to eliminate this, and we'll put the kilogram on the top. And when we do this conversion, we find out that 170 pounds is equivalent to approximately 77 kilograms. Now, what we want, though, is remember we want to find out the protein RDA in terms of the number of grams required per day. So we have this conversion factor up here where we have 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. And when we carry out this multiplication, we find that we need approximately 62 grams of protein per day in order to meet the RDA, the minimum requirement. Now, we do have some essential amino acids. There are 10 in children, there are 8 in the adult. Remember when we talked about essential nutrients, we said that these are things that cannot be synthesized by the body. And you can see the list of essential amino acids down here. So these are amino acids that we need to take in the diet from the things that we eat. And in children, of course, we have 2 additional ones that adults can make, but children cannot. Now, how do we use proteins? Well, one of the pathways is we can take proteins through digestion. We can break them down into their components, which of course are amino acids. And if we look at this route here, we can see that we can then make proteins that will fill several different functions in the body. This is a more complete list down the bottom. So this is the list of different functions that some of the proteins that we take in can be used to do. As you see on this slide, there's actually another pathway as well. This takes us here. And several things we can do with those amino acids is we can convert them into glucose via pyruvate. We can convert them into fat via pyruvate, then acetyl-CoA, then to fatty acids. And we can also use them for energy. So we can get energy from these in the form of ATP. Now, all of these require an extra step, which is right here, and we're going to talk about right now. This extra step is what we term deamination, which you see right here. What has to happen is that the amino group that's on amino acids in the proteins has to be removed before we can actually use them for energy, before we can convert them into glucose, before we can convert them into fatty acids. The amino group on an amino acid is right here, if you remember the general structure from AMP1. And what has to be done is this has to be removed. The rest of this can then go on and be used for energy, or it can be used to make glucose, it can be used to make fatty acids. Now, this process of deamination can take the amino acids, and as a byproduct, we make urea. However, this is not the whole story, because urea is not made in one simple step. It actually involves a couple of steps. In the initial deamination of amino acids, we generate these compounds, ammonia or ammonium ion, and these are highly toxic, even in very small amounts in the body. So these have to be rapidly converted by the liver to something that's more harmless, and that is urea. The liver can convert these to urea, which is harmless, water-soluble substance, and this can be excreted in the urine. Once the deamination is accomplished, you can see we can use this for energy, to produce ATP. We can convert the amino acids into glucose. We can convert the amino acids eventually into fat as well. So this is an important first step. This is called deamination. Other than storing nitrogen in the proteins in the body, nitrogen is really not stored or maintained. So we only have about 1 kilogram of nitrogen in the body at any one time. Although, of course, we have a lot more muscle protein than that. The total amount of nitrogen that we have is about 1 kilogram. But we do have other compounds in the body that contain nitrogen that we would not consider proteins, like amino acids, purines, pyrimidines, creatine, porphyrins. All of these are nitrogen-containing compounds, but are not proteins. When we are between meals, or when we're in starvation mode, that is, we haven't eaten for a long time, the body will have to seek other sources of glucose. In other words, there's no glucose coming into the body. We have to get glucose from someplace, because you remember that this is the main energy source for the body. The body has a preferential order of usage of different metabolites in order to get glucose that it needs to metabolize. The first order is carbohydrate. Remember that we have stored carbohydrate in the form of glycogen, especially in skeletal muscle and in liver. The body will try to harvest this first and use the glycogen, because it's basically easy to get glucose from that, because we can chop off 1 unit at a time from the glycogen. Once the stores of glycogen are gone or are getting very low, the body will turn to fat. And as you remember from the diagram we saw in the very beginning of the first part of this lecture, we can take the fat, break it down through lipolysis, and we can harvest energy from that. Finally, if there's no more glycogen and there's no more fat, the body will turn to protein as an energy source. As we just saw, we can deaminate amino acids from the proteins, and we can make energy from those. But this is a last resort. And the reason for this is when the body starts to turn to protein for energy, what we're actually doing is breaking down the skeletal muscle that we have in the body. This is why if you see somebody in an advanced state of starvation, you see the muscles kind of withering away and they get very, very thin. This is also known as cachexia. And this is something that you might see in advanced cancer patients or people who have been without food for a long time. Now, another concept we want to talk about is about nitrogen balance. Whenever we use the word balance in terms of really anything in the body, we're talking about amount in equals amount out. So in terms of nitrogen balance, we mean that the amount of nitrogen taken into the body is equal to the amount that we excrete or use. Negative nitrogen balance would develop from starvation. That is, we're not taking in enough nitrogen compared to the amount of nitrogen that we're getting rid of or excreting. On the other hand, we have cases of positive nitrogen balance. For example, growing children, they eat and they actually incorporate more nitrogen from their diet than they're getting rid of. So this results in a positive nitrogen balance. Pregnant women, there's a fetus, of course, growing, and the fetus is taking up nitrogen. So the pregnant woman is taking in more nitrogen than she's excreting. Athletes in training are another good example, especially those who try to build more muscle. They're taking in more nitrogen than they're excreting. So these are all examples of positive nitrogen balance. The best example of negative nitrogen balance is starvation, as we see here. Now I want to talk a little bit about metabolic states. Now that we've talked about proteins and nitrogen content, there are two metabolic states that we can be in the body. One is known as the fed state, This is immediately after a meal until about maybe 4 to 5 hours after we've eaten. After about 4 to 5 hours post-meal or postprandial, we would refer to that as the fasted state. So let's talk about the fed state first. Once again, what we're doing here is we're absorbing nutrients that we've just taken in. The process of digestion is carried out, and once the nutrients we've taken in are small enough, we can absorb them into the body. The major classes of what we absorb, as we talked about, were lipids, amino acid, and sugars, in this case glucose. What's done with these products of digestion is that lipids are converted into triglycerides. They're stored as triglycerides. We can also use the lipids for ATP production in skeletal muscle, for example. The amino acids can be used for protein synthesis to replace some of the worn out components of the body or to synthesize new protein. And finally, the glucose can be used as well for ATP production in all but skeletal muscle, which uses the lipids or the fatty acids. And then in the liver and skeletal muscle, if we have more glucose than we need at the current moment, we can store this as glycogen, as we talked about before in the process of glycogenesis. Now, there's one hormone that predominates during the fed or absorptive state, and this is the hormone insulin. Insulin is really a storage hormone. What this will do is it'll promote the uptake of glucose by cells, and it will also change the metabolic pathways of cells to go into what's called a storage mode. So we'll store glycogen, for example. We'll store the excess fats as triglycerides, interconvert molecules so that we can store them as glycogen and triglycerides, increase the synthesis of proteins. So insulin is really the major hormone of the fed state. So let's turn our attention to the fasted or post-absorptive state. Levels of glucose will begin to drop in the blood because we haven't eaten. But the body needs a certain level of glucose to be in the blood in order to carry out metabolism. So what we have to do is make withdrawals from all the body tissues and get those things out that we can use for energy. The liver is one of the main sources of metabolites that we can use to power the body between meals. We can create ketone bodies, and we talked about these before. Remember beta-hydroxybutyric acid, acetoacetic acid. These can also actually be used for ATP production. In other words, we can use these for energy. And as you know, we can carry out gluconeogenesis. We can convert things like pyruvate, oxaloacetic acid, back into glucose, and the glucose, of course, can be used then to produce ATP. Now, in adipose tissue, we can break down triglycerides in the process of lipolysis. And the lipids that we have here can be used as well for ATP production. So the 2 carbon units from fatty acids by the process of beta oxidation can be used to produce ATP. Skeletal muscle can do 2 things. One of the things it can do is break down glycogen that's been stored. This is the process of glycogenolysis. This will break these down, harvest the glucose, and eventually perhaps produce some glucose as well as lactic acid. We can actually convert that lactic acid into glucose through gluconeogenesis. The other thing skeletal muscles can do is in the event that we do not have any more glycogen or we don't have any more fat in the body, this can begin breaking down protein through enzymes that are known as cathepsins. These are really just proteases, enzymes that break down proteins. And there's a number of cathepsins that we use in the body. These can produce amino acids. As you know, if we take those amino acids and deaminate them, we can use them for energy production. In gluconeogenesis, we can also create ketone bodies with them, and as we saw before, we can use ketone bodies for energy in the body. So really, this is a removal state. In other words, we're removing all these different things from the body stores in order to keep levels of glucose up. Now, there are several hormones that function in this fasted state, and these hormones you can see here. For example, glucocorticoids that we're going to talk about with the endocrine system, glucagon, epinephrine. These really are the main hormones of the fasted state. These are the things that will pull the stores of metabolites out of the body tissues and provide energy for the body. Now, just very briefly, we can review the chart that we looked at before. We've talked about several of these different states now. We've talked about the metabolism of lipids, carbohydrates, proteins, and the interconversion of these. So once again, this chart is important for you to have a good sense of because this will tell you how metabolites are interconverted from one thing to the other. These terms, if you remember, I said were very important as well. Lipogenesis, lipolysis, glycogenolysis, glycogenesis, glycolysis, and gluconeogenesis. I have a summary table for these in this slide. I gave you some root words on the top, olysis meaning breakdown, genesis creation of, neo meaning new. So this will help you break down some of these words. The hormones I listed up here in terms of the fed and fasted state hormones. Remember, the main hormone of the fed state is insulin. The main hormones of the fasted state are glucagon, corticosteroids, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. And then down in this table below, I have provided the definitions of these things for you, and also provided when these processes predominate, that is during the fed state or the fasted state. So it's important for you to know all the definitions and root words on this slide. Now, what about energy requirements in the body? Well, first let's talk about something called the basal metabolic rate. As the name implies, this is the rate at which the body expends energy at rest. Here we're talking about sitting, not doing any kind of exercise, at least 4 hours or so after we've eaten. And so this really is just reflecting the energy that we need to support the activities of organs. In other words, just to keep the body alive. And we refer to that as the basal metabolic rate. And this will vary with gender, with body size, with body temperature, with endocrine function. And in terms of endocrine function, we're really talking especially about thyroid hormone, which is one of the major regulators of cellular metabolism throughout the body. And as you see on the bottom, and as we said above, this supports resting muscular activity. It's needed just to maintain our normal body temperature, and also it would be needed for growth in children and pregnant women. Now, BMR is proportional to body weight, so we mentioned body size before. The more the body weight, the higher is the BMR. A couple of interesting facts. The body's basal metabolic rate falls about 10% during sleep and about 40% during prolonged starvation. This was a great adaptation during periods when we didn't really have food readily available. However, these days when we try to diet, this decrease in BMR can actually get in the way, right? We know that after a week or so, it becomes more difficult to lose weight. And one of the reasons for this is that the BMR begins to fall, trying to adapt to the deficiency of nutrients. And finally, just to reiterate once again, BMR is profoundly affected by circulating thyroid hormone levels, as we said before. Remember, before we talked about nitrogen balance, here we're going to talk about energy balance, and we measure energy in the form of calories. So what we're talking about in terms of energy balance is that the amount of calories taken in is going to equal the amount of calories burned. When we have a positive energy balance, we're talking about taking in more calories than we use. This will lead to weight gain. When we talk about negative energy balance, we're using more calories than we take in, and this can lead to weight loss. This really is common knowledge. You go on a diet, you reduce the number of calories you take in, and hopefully you lose weight until you hit that plateau after the first week from your BMR going down. Now let's talk a little bit about this measure of body mass, which is known as body mass index. This was developed by the World Health Organization, and this is just a general statistical categorization of different classes of body mass index. So this is really a general guide. And you notice the formula for this is the weight in kilograms divided by the height squared in meters. There's another formula for this that takes the weight in pounds and height in inches, and there's a correction factor that has to be applied of about 700 or so. What I do want you to know is the categories that you see in the table down here. And as I said, these are just general statistical categories. Somebody who has a BMI of less than 18.5 is considered very thin. And one of the reasons we like to know this is this sometimes indicates that there's a nutritional disorder. In other words, somebody might have a disorder in terms of absorbing nutrients. Sometimes there's an eating disorder that can bring this about. Somebody who has a healthy or normal body mass index has a BMI between 18.5 and about 24.9. So something less than 25 and greater than 18.5. Overweight is considered 25.0 to 29.9. Obese, 30.0 to 39.9, and morbidly obese, anything greater than a BMI of about 40. So these categories are important for you to know. Now we have to throw a disclaimer in here in the fact that somebody can have a high weight to height ratio for a reason other than having an excess amount of body fat, right? You know, for example, bodybuilders have a tremendous amount of muscle mass, and if we look at their BMI, they would likely be in one of these categories here. However, we wouldn't call them overweight or obese in the sense that somebody is overly fat. It's their muscles that are actually contributing to the increased weight. So you have to be a little bit careful about using these categories, and as I said, these are just meant to be general statistical guides to weight classes. Now the last subject we want to talk about is about vitamins and minerals. Vitamins are essential nutrients. Remember, we talked about these as organic substances that we need from outside the body to meet the body's needs. These are usually divided into two different categories, the water-soluble vitamins and the fat-soluble vitamins. The water-soluble vitamins include the vitamin B group, there are a number of these, and also vitamin C. These generally are not stored in the body, except as we'll see for vitamin B12 and vitamin C, to a limited extent, and any excesses that we have can be excreted in the urine. In other words, if we take too much of a B vitamin or too much of a C vitamin, these are easily excreted in the urine because they're water-soluble. On the other hand, the fat-soluble vitamins like vitamins A, D, E, and K are stored in liver, adipose, some other tissues in the body. So excesses of these, if taken over a long period of time, can actually accumulate in tissues and can cause other disorders. So taking too many of the fat-soluble vitamins is far more dangerous than taking excesses of water-soluble vitamins. Let's take a look at the fat-soluble vitamins first. These, very importantly, are absorbed with fats in the digestive tract. This is one of the reasons it's not a good idea to take vitamins on an empty stomach. In other words, vitamins should be taken with meals. One of the reasons for this is we have to have the fats in the meal in order to take in and then absorb the fat-soluble vitamins. Now, what about the functions of these fat-soluble vitamins? Vitamin A is a structural component of retinal. If you remember from Anatomy and Physiology 1, we talked about this as being a component in rhodopsin in the eyes. So a deficiency of vitamin A, you might suspect, leads to night blindness. Vitamin D increases absorption of calcium and phosphorus from the intestine. We've talked about this a number of times through the course. So any deficiency in vitamin D would lead to maybe an osteoporosis or any condition where we have a decreased calcium. Remember that vitamin D can also be produced from the skin under the influence of UV light. There are cells in the epidermis of the skin that can produce vitamin D when UV irradiated. Vitamin E is one of the major antioxidants, and it has a major stabilizing effect on cellular membranes. And finally, vitamin K, think of the K for clotting. Some of the bacteria in the intestine manufacture vitamin K for us, which we absorb. We can also find this in green leafy vegetables. Now, what about the water-soluble vitamins? Once again, these are easily excreted from the body, and these flow between the different fluid compartments in the body and the digestive tract and the blood. These are easily excreted in the urine, as we said. And we're talking about the B group of vitamins, and we're also talking about vitamin C. Now, vitamin B12 can actually be stored in the liver. We usually have enough vitamin B to last about 2 years or so. So we don't generally see deficiencies of vitamin B12 except in vegetarians. One of the reasons for this is the main sources of vitamin B12 include fish, shellfish, meat, eggs, dairy. So we sometimes find that vegetarians who don't eat those things begin to have deficiencies in vitamin B12. Always a good idea for a vegetarian to take a vitamin B12 supplement. Vitamin C is also stored in some of the different tissues in the body, for example, in the adrenal, the pituitary, the thymus, in the retina even. But this is only about a 2-week store. Now, the B vitamins as a group are used as coenzymes to harvest energy from foods. For example, vitamin B1, which is thiamine, is very important. This actually helps the conversion of pyruvate to acetyl-CoA. Should be familiar with that. Things like riboflavin, niacin. These form the basis of those high-energy electron carriers that we talked about in AMP1. Remember nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, you'll know that as NAD. Flavin adenine dinucleotide, which is FAD, and FADH2. These were used to harvest or to capture those high-energy electrons released from the metabolism of glucose and then carry them down to the electron transport chain. Biotin is another B vitamin. For example, this one is very important in the synthesis of fatty acids from those acetyl-CoA groups. So there are a number of B vitamins, and as a group, they're used to harvest energy from the food that we eat. Vitamin B12 has some other important functions in hematopoiesis. We talked about that in the beginning of the course, in maintenance of the myelin sheath, as well as in epithelial cells. Now, vitamin C also has the name ascorbic acid. You should know this name. And some of the functions of vitamin C is that it functions in collagen production. So without vitamin C, we don't promote proper cross-linking of collagen fibers. Collagen doesn't function the way it should, and so many of the connective tissues in the body don't form the way that they should. Vitamin C is also an important antioxidant. It's an immune system booster. And whenever we take vitamin C, it also helps the absorption of iron in the intestinal tract. So pretty much anytime you take iron, you also want to take vitamin C at the same time. Now the very last topic I want to talk about, and there are 3 tables that follow here. I won't go through them all. I'll just show you the first one. There are certain minerals that I want you to know. What I would like you to know is you see this column here in the first one, the second one, the 5th one. So from the first column, I'd like you to know the name of the mineral. The second column, you should know the symbol for the mineral. We're going to come back to these again when we talk about water electrolyte acid-base balance. And finally, I'd also like you to know their major functions, which you see here. There are 3 of these tables, and you notice that some of them are in red with asterisks, and some of them are not. So the ones that don't have anything next to them, you don't have to worry about. The ones that are in red and that have an asterisk, I would like you to know. The reason I put the asterisks here is because if you print this out in black and white, you'll be able to see the ones that you need to know. Okay? And as I said, there are 3 tables here. There's one here. There's one here with a couple of minerals you don't have to know. And the last table only really has one kind of mandatory, if you will, mineral that I would like you to know. The rest you don't have to go over. I added them here for completeness. So if you want to sometime later, you can come back and take a look at these. Okay, that finishes off part 2 of our nutritional lectures. And that actually finishes our entire digestive system segment. Up next in the course, we're going to be talking about the endocrine system, and that's going to be lecture 13. I'll see you there.